Now more than ever, it's important for you and your family to enjoy the spaces you're in most often. Visit FergusonShowrooms.com to shop online or schedule a personalized consultation to meet with our experts at your local Ferguson Bath, Kitchen, and Lighting Gallery. Together, we'll help you make the most of home and create a space you'll love to live in. Get started on your project and discover extraordinary products like the Quartz Luxe Undermount Kitchen Sink from LK.
Hey, welcome to the 260th episode of Just Shoot It, a podcast about filmmaking, screenwriting, and directing. This episode is brought to you by patrons Deanna Begtol, Joe Harris, and Cody Flores-Harigi. I'm Matt Enlow.
And I'm Oren Kaplan, and today we have Andy Strahorn on the podcast. He is a cinematographer of many cool things, most recently Lethal Weapon on Fox and 911 Lone Star, the Ryan Murphy show, and it's fun. We haven't really talked to a network TV, like big procedural type of cinematographer before, right?
Yeah, no, it's really fun. I think he offers a perspective that both, I think, indie filmmakers and up-and-comers will relate to, certainly. He kind of came from that world, but also he really sheds light on the perspective of these kind of big procedural action directors, right? You know, like you mentioned, it's like he did a lot of Lethal Weapon. He's now on Lone Star, so like we talk about how to shoot explosions, stunts, all of that red tape, you know, is really fascinating.
The explosions thing was really interesting to me because I know you've shot like some flamethrower stuff. I've shot some sparks and little mishaps, but I don't think I've actually filmed many explosions or fires. Have you?
Pyro, yeah. Well, the flamethrower, we had like a full bonfire and like an honest to goodness flamethrower. It was hot. It was scary. And I think like the way that one approaches pyro is unique and specific. And I think Andy does a really wonderful job of shedding light on just the thought process. You know, none of it is rocket science, but you do have to think like, oh, like what's going to make this look the best? Because I only am going to get one shot at it, most likely.
Yeah, and I think that's most people's instincts. Like, oh, we're going to blow up this building, we're going to blow up this model, we're going to blow this thing up. We're only going to get one shot. Let's put as many cameras on it as possible. GoPro, let's get slow-mo, let's do all this stuff. But the thing that he cares more about than the one shot aspect of it is the light exposure aspect of it.
Exposure, sure.
Because,
which would be easy to underthink, you know?
Yeah, because an explosion is a fire. It usually, especially if you're shooting it at night, it drastically changes the lighting on the entire set, and it is very, very bright. And so if you want it to not blow out, you have to expose very darkly, but then you won't see anything before the explosion, and he talks a lot about that. So I think it's a fun challenge to overcome.
And also even just the experience of what it feels like to be around an explosion. Sometimes a little overexposure feels visceral, you know? So being strategic about what cameras are exposed in what ways and thinking about the way that the explosion will relate to the edit, I think was really masterful and insightful and, you know, something that you only get from experience.
The one other thing I found really interesting about Andy talking about their approach to filming 911 Lone Star was that he said the camera approach when they are filming fires is that the camera should feel like it's a member of the team that is putting out the fire. And I think we, especially the more pretentious of us, like the ones who went to USC Film School and all that stuff, think of network television as like this real formulaic thing. Everyone, you just kind of plug any DP in, any director in, and the show kind of just makes itself. But it's fun to hear that there's actually a lot more intention and creativity and a strive to not just do like a long lens master and then like, you know, 2 steady cam shots or whatever. They're really trying to make art that happens to be very commercial at the same time. So it's fun hearing Andy's approach to that and his whole attitude about the whole thing.
I think that's why oftentimes shows like that will have a consistent DP across, or I think in Andy's case, I think he's one of 2 and they are kind of prepping and then rolling into it. He breaks it down for us. But that consistency goes a long way towards being able to implement kind of a broader vision for what the show needs to be that also will translate across multiple storylines and different types of characters and different scenarios so that it all feels cohesive, like it's all, you know, one great show, but also gives you room and latitude to to play and experiment and lean into what's particular and special about each scene that you're shooting.
Yeah. No, it's really cool. But before we talk to Andy, we are going to actually answer one quick listener question from one of the patrons that was mentioned at the opening of this episode, Deanna Begtol. So Deanna says that she loves our wonderful podcast. I can't agree with her more on that. And she says that she's interested in editing. She has some experience in DaVinci Resolve and Premiere Pro, but she'd like to master an editing tool. She says, I'm confused as to which the most widely used or in-demand tool is and whether or not I should look into getting some kind of certification, or is just a reel better? And if a reel is the answer, should the reel consist of my own content in place of paid work, or should it have both? Thanks, Deanna, for the question. Thanks, Deanna, for the question. For once, we might have kind of a straightforward answer.
I think there's a few parts to break down, though, first. So there's the question of, like, do I need a certificate or not, or any sort of accreditation? And then also what the industry standard is in terms of what to cut on, what to master, and then what should a reel look like. Those are the three parts, I feel like. So let's start with accreditation. Oren, have you ever asked to see or thought about whether or not someone is an accredited editor of any sort?
Yeah, of course. That's the first thing I ask someone is like, let me see your certification. Please fax that over to me on my fax machine. No, of course not. No one, I don't think anyone cares about that.
Well, it's tricky because I think that there are a lot of schools and programs out there, even I feel like I can remember Apple used to have an accreditation program for Final Cut, right? Where you would go through the class, you'd spend a bunch of money, and you'd kind of step by step go through that stuff. And I totally understand where people are coming from with that question, because if I were to say, want to become some other sort of professional, you do have to have some sort of certification, whether you're a bartender or a dental hygienist or, an engineer. Like, there's all sorts of different, societies built on accreditation, whether it's a trade school or a college, right? And so it makes sense to be like, well, yeah, I want to be an editor, so I should go to school for editing. That said, the industry typically, in our experience, runs on referrals. And so I've never seen an editor's resume even. I will maybe IMDb them or look at their website. But for the most part, I work with editors one of two ways. Either it's a referral, I take a look at their reel, I'm like, okay, this is great. And more importantly, I'm looking at the filmmakers that they've worked with. Do I know them? Do I know their work? And then the other thing is sometimes I'll just get introduced to them through the company that I'm working for. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, I'm working at this commercial company and they've got a person that's in-house or someone that they like to work with. They really come strongly endorsed, and that's how I would meet them, basically. But so I've never looked at a resume.
Yeah, I think the certification thing is like a relic of the old days when not everyone had access to all the editing tools on their computer at home. It was proof that you went and actually learned things. And I think it's still valuable for things like, I'm a Mac certified repair service person, Like, I know how to open up your computer and I know what the pieces are doing and I can talk to Apple about the issues. But in terms of editing, it's much more about the skills and like you said, for me, it's like all referrals and recommendations. And honestly, like at least 50% of the time I get an editor from the production company I'm working with, I'm like disappointed in them.
But that has nothing to do with their mastery of the tools.
No. Yeah.
100% of the editors that you worked with know most, if not all, of the ins and outs of like the different types of edits. I will say, though, it's important to acknowledge that people learn different ways. And so sometimes if you're really like craving a classroom environment and you're not really into video tutorials and you need assignments and you want to ask questions and stuff, those certification programs, I think, are probably, having no experience with them, I could understand why someone would be curious about it from that perspective. But that is different than whether or not it is any sort of job requirement in terms of getting hired.
Yeah, it won't help you get a job, but it might help you get a job if your professor or whatever is also looking for editors and getting opportunities for their students. I mean, I'm all for learning editing in a classroom environment and all that stuff. I think that's super helpful. Just the certification, I think, is a little bit of a relic from the past for editing specifically, because we just have there's not such a gatekeeper paradigm for having access to the software.
Okay, so then let's make software the last thing then, because I'm curious, when you are looking at a reel, Deanna asked, should it be her own work or should it be paid work or a combination of both?
I think it should just be whatever you have that looks good. I mean, if you've seen my reel, you know I think it's nice to have recognizable faces on it if you have any, even if the footage doesn't look good or there isn't much editing in it. But it's like Will Ferrell showed up for 10 seconds on this thing you like barely edited. It's, to me, that's like about showing that people trusted you with like bigger projects. They're kind of higher caliber projects. And I can tell you some things I don't like in an editing reel. I have my number one pet peeve is when the entire reel is like in anamorphic aspect ratio or something, like a 2:3:5 bars, where like, to me, I want to see a breadth of work. So I kind of don't want everything to be in the same aspect ratio unless it's all 16:9, because that's all you've done, you know?
Yeah, I would say I tend to agree with that. However, I think that is particular to you, Oren, specifically. You know, I don't think that other directors necessarily would say that. I think your point is like, oh, I just want to see a lot of different types of stuff, and this is an indicator that maybe you haven't done as much work as I'd like or something.
Well, I guess I've seen a lot of editors
don't get hung up on it, is what I'm saying. You know?
Yeah, no, I'm saying like don't change the aspect ratio of like the original thing to match the clips that are before it and after it, which is what I've seen happen a lot.
And I guess what I'm saying is that like, if you're like, hey, I really like the way this looks, to have it consistent, and I think that it's jarring to jump from one thing to the next, you do you. You know, like, you may not get hired by Oren Kaplan, but like,
right. Well, if I can't tell,
but your point of like
done,
diversity, you want a lot of different work. Yeah, I will say I don't like an editing reel, frankly. I want to watch your actual editing, unless I'm like looking to hire you for sizzle editing, in which case, frankly, I just want to see what sizzles you're working on. Like, to me, you know, I want to see scene work, so I'd rather just watch, you know, selected scenes, or if it's a commercial, the entirety of a few spots that you've cut, frankly.
Yeah, if you have a lot of short form stuff that you can show me, like 3 different clips that are each a minute, 30 seconds to a minute long, that's awesome. If you do commercials, it's really easy to do a reel. But yeah, it's kind of like directors. You don't necessarily want to watch like all the best shots a director's ever made. You want to see if they can put a scene together. And so yeah, whether it's your own work or not, it matters. But to me, variety is helpful. So some of your own work and some of other people's work is great.
I'll give you this rule of thumb when it comes to your body of work, whether that's in a sizzle or just like in a web page, or however you want to present it, whatever makes the most sense for you. I think that we as directors, and I think other companies will see it as well, what you are presenting should be on par with the project that you are pitching to get. And so, is it okay that you don't have a ton of celebrities, for instance, or super big budget projects on your reel early on starting out? Of course it's okay. Are you going to get those big celebrity spots and the big jobs with that reel? Probably not. And so whether it's paid work or your own personal work, it kind of has to be commensurate with what you're pitching on. And, you know, then you build relationships. And as, you know, the company that you're working with, the directors that you work with are leveling up, they're kind of ideally taking you along with them. And you'll make incremental steps, but you can't go from a really great student film, but that, you know, feels like it's budget, even if it's great, to something, to a Marvel movie that's just, the jump is too great, basically.
Right. And I'll say, I just have like 2 other things about editing reels personally. And I mean, like Matt says, like everyone has different opinions on this.
I'm busting balls. I'm just saying, like, I don't want any listeners at home to be like, well, Oren said this, and, you know, even though my instincts are telling me the opposite.
Yeah, don't trust your instincts. Trust me on this. No, but the 2 other things is an editor's reel is not super unlike an actor's reel, in which it has a much higher chance of losing them the job than getting them the job. You know, if you see an actor's reel and there's 3 or 4 scenes, and in 3 scenes it's Law and Order, but they had 1 line and they did a good job or whatever. Then there's 1 scene that's like a lot of meat to chew and it's bad. Then you're like, yeah, we're not going to hire this actor. And with editing, this is a thing that I've seen editing reels that kind of bugs me, is when the music and the sound is not like an integral part of the edit, especially in a montage reel. Like, I want to see when there's like a swell in the music, a something visual is happening, and I do not want to see people talking without hearing what they're saying. That's like my other huge pet peeve is just like they call it lip flap, where people are moving their mouth, but I'm not hearing what they're saying. To me, it just feels like amateurish, you know, in a way. So remember that in an editor's reel, it's not just the visuals and how they're cut. It's also about sound and music. And to me, that stuff for an editor's reel is a lot more important than like graphics, let's say, you know, or visual effects or things that editors some people might think editors are responsible for, but in general, like I want to see how you put shots together and how you put sound and music to those shots. So that's my thing. But, you know, we work on specific types of things, you know, and so that's what's helpful for us. But I'll also echo what Matt said, that like 90% of how I choose an editor is based on referrals and recommendations.
But I think also your comparison to actors is apt, because oftentimes actors are being judged not just for their performance, but for what they chose to put on their reel. So if it looks cheap, or if the writing's bad, or if the directing pushes a performer into something that's overwrought or melodramatic or just, you know, quote unquote not good, it's better to not have it on the reel than it is to show us, even hoping that we're going to see past maybe some of the shortcomings of the other departments, basically. And I think the same is true for editing. It goes back to my rule of thumb. Like, you know, you have to punch your own weight on these sorts of things. So if you've got a bunch of student projects and you're pitching on a student project, perfect. Don't worry about it, you know, and hopefully that one's a little bit better and maybe gets you some paid work and all that stuff. But it's not about who paid you. It's just about like what the perceived quote unquote quality is.
Yeah. And I mean, trust me, Matt and I have made a lot of stuff that we think is quite bad and quite embarrassing, and we just wouldn't put it on our own reels. So it's not saying that you can't make bad stuff, just don't put it on your reel.
Yeah. Or even, you know, if you put it on your reel because you're like, well, I don't have anything else, then just know that it's going to be a limit to what you can get in the future, and that slowly you have to cycle that stuff out. I should dig up my very first reel. I made a lot of like custom shots that were like I could make in my bedroom, or were animated and were like, you know, not always bad, but not illustrating any sort of body of work. I was cheating. I was trying to make it look like I'd done more work than I had, you know, or I'd done like a Converse spec spot or like all sorts of stuff, all of which is okay. But, you know, my point is just that your progress will be incremental, and that's the journey. That's what we're trying to show with this podcast.
Yeah. Do you think someone's ever really cheated on a reel? Like just taken like a Super Bowl commercial and like an episode of Modern Family and just cut some scenes that other people had put together and just put them on their own reel and gotten a job that way? Like kind of how Tarantino had the like fake whatever film school or Harvard recommend, like, right? Didn't he?
Yeah. I mean, that story sort of rings a bell. I think that maybe that would work in the short term. I can say this. My commercial rep knows all of the directors who did those spots. Do you know what I mean? Like at a certain point, you get into the league where you can say that you directed this spot, but we all know that Mark Malloy did.
Right,
so,
but editing is like a little,
you know, sure, it's a little different. That's true. Yeah. But it's like, oh, have you worked at the mill? That's exciting. Why are you pitching on this smaller job now? You know, like it'll get you eventually.
Okay, don't cheat then.
Don't cheat. Final question. Software. Straightforward. If you want to be a TV editor, Avid. If you want to freelance, Premiere.
Yeah. If you want to not spend any money on software, Resolve. Yeah. I mean, they're all great. To be honest, I don't have a ton of experience with Avid personally.
Yeah. Same. The only people I ever work with on Avid are the people who are making TV shows. But the Resolve question actually is valuable. I've never cut anything in Resolve. I'm sure that will maybe change eventually, but I've colored everything in Resolve. So I think it's handy to know the offlining process and like conform if you really want to. That's a good entry level thing to do anyway. And especially if you're meticulous and detail oriented, knowing your way around Resolve is a good way to kind of get your feet wet and stuff. I don't think you will be doing heavy duty editing in Resolve in the near future. That may change, and maybe it's already happening. And please write in if you're like, hey, I just did my first commercial spot or TV show in Resolve, and I'm just like oblivious
think it's getting
to it.
very popular. I think it's like the blender of editing software. At least I see a lot of people and like more like kind of the influencers and like one-man band type of people like editing in Resolve. So Deanna, if you are enjoying Resolve, I'd encourage you to keep going. Just make yourself familiar with Premiere too, because if you're going to ever pass your edit on to someone else or edit with a team, it'll probably be Premiere unless you're working on a TV show or like a studio feature. And the reason I love Premiere is because it's an Adobe product and it just really plugs in quite easily with After Effects and Photoshop and all those other Adobe tools. And I just pay for all of them anyway, and like the whole master suite for the subscription. So they have really amazing student rates if you want to do that. But otherwise, Resolve, go for it. I think you can import and export Premiere projects.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, good luck, Deanna. Keep us posted on how things go. If people disagree with any of the things that we said, please let us know, because I think that I'm happy to be corrected in this capacity, especially, but in all ways, especially on this podcast.
Cool. Well, before we talk to Andy, I just want to remind people real quick that we have a Patreon. Like Deanna Begtol, she's a patron, and she has a Just Shoot It hat, because at a certain level of patronage, $10, you get a Just Shoot It hat. It is one of the coolest hats that Matt and I have ever made together. And we recommend you check it out. And it helps us keep making this podcast every week. So check it out. Patreon.com/JustShootItPod.
And with that, let's have a conversation with Andy Strahorn.
Did you start out doing more comedy type stuff and then get into...
No, starting back home, shooting in the my feature career in the early 2000s, it was one of those things, like particularly back in Australia, that the industry's a little smaller than it is here. So any opportunity is a great thing, because it really is a pecking order down under. And you come to the United States and there's a lot more...
Wait, what do you mean by pecking order? Like it's Baz Luhrmann, Nicole Kidman, and then everybody else?
Again, it was a different time back then, but it was more of this traditional hierarchy that the cameramen that were around, the established cameramen, were usually first cab off the rank. And then, so you start with breadcrumbs. But I started out shooting horror. I shot with a couple of blokes that were commercial directors, and obviously prior to features you shoot commercials and whatnot, but drama and long form was always my ambition. So I ended up starting to shoot little low budget horror, and then that got me to the US. And then so you come over here, and you're a very small tadpole in a very large pond. So at that point you're just gravitating towards meeting people, hustling.
Right. So how far into your career, like how many years ago did you move to the US?
I moved here in 2005, and late 2005, and the movie came over in June, July through a limited release with Lionsgate called Undead, and I just decided to stay. And it was a very interesting time for me, because over 3 or 4 years prior, the commercial directors I was working with in Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne were starting to do national spots. So then there were some really nice spots coming out. And at the peak of that, I came to the US and then started from scratch over here.
Did you ever fly home to shoot for them?
No, because I had the mindset that, it's almost like that Viking sort of perception of the new world, like burn the boat, because if you can't go back, you're gonna
figure it out. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's the thing, right? We're all filmmakers, and we all have a path at some point or another where you're just waiting for that phone to call, and you'll do anything for it. So there are sometimes you might not necessarily be eating steak, you might be eating something else. So when you start, the idea of the attraction of the evil money is so easy to fall into that, going, hey, you go home and shoot one commercial. Next thing you know, hey, you're around, come shoot this tomorrow or next week. And next thing you know, that you'll never get back. So, it's a good first world problems, but that I just thought, if I go back to Oz, I'll never come back.
And is there not, I mean, they must shoot TV shows and things, right?
They do, but it's a very different mindset. I think the thing that makes, it's very interesting. Back home, it's very artistic, and it's supported by the local government. It's supported by the federal government. So here it's a business. And that was the most interesting transition from Australia to here. The one thing that Australia afforded me was, because of the limitations of not only gear, but time, you're shooting in the pretty harsh environment for the most part. It afforded me there is this mentality that is cultural back home in Australia, that if you don't shoot efficiently, I don't want to say fast, but if you don't shoot efficiently and you cost me too much money, you'll never get hired. So I think most Aussie cameramen come out of that world of going, in order to keep this gravy train going and to explore and keep creatively shooting and all of that, you've got to come from that standpoint. So you can do a lot with a little, and that that seems to play out favorably coming to this country. So it that hustle that you learned back there, you come here, and most Aussies seem to do okay over here. So it's an attribute that I really appreciate. But the shows back there, the gear that we have here, take for example, I've been shooting action shows for the last 5 years between Lethal and Lone Star, cops and firemen, and we're fortunate enough you can have a techno for 2 or 3 days, 4 days out of a 9-10 day episode. So knowing the tool isn't everything, but knowing what you can do with that tool, then it becomes a huge benefit, not only logistical, but artistic and all of that. You can do a lot more, but back home, you don't necessarily have that. It might be a fixed arm on a dolly track, so it's just it's a different way of doing it. I was actually back home. Well, when I say back home, Southern Hemisphere, I shot a pilot with Mick G in 2019 for Disney ABC, and that was it was a pretty expensive pilot, and it was this really cool scenario about this other world within a Bermuda Triangle, and it was interesting going back home to, well, that was New Zealand, but the same mentality, because Aussies and New Zealanders move, from one country, of the can-do attitude. We don't have this, but we can do it this way, and it was refreshing to see that again, and this kind of, well, bugger it, let's just do it, so that was good.
It's funny to hear. I think we do have a good number of like international listeners as well who are like thinking about moving and like trying to figure out what the timing is. But I love the mentality of like, oh, because I came up with a limitation in terms of gear, that then I like really could stretch it when I get to the big leagues. But how nice it is to go back to that mentality of like, well, let's just go for it. Like you don't have to have the techno crane for 5 days out of your 9-day pilot or whatever, kind of straddling back and forth.
I remember when I first came here and I was sitting in one of the features I first started on, and they said, oh, so what size condor do you want? And I was like, condor? What are we talking about birds for? Because we just use scissor lifts back home. Or I'll even throw it back even further, scaff towers. So that's just how we do it. You put up a 20-foot scaff tower and you put a lamp on it, and you're kind of fixed. But that's what happens, and that's what we were born out of. There's a lot of pros and cons on both sides of the fence, but do
you ever miss that though? I feel like you hear a lot of DPs, they have kind of everything they would ever want, the Steadicams and the Condors and the helium blimps and all that stuff, and then they're like, I just kind of want to do that, like, just a camera on my shoulder. Do you like to kind of bounce back and forth, or do you kind of just feel like bigger is better?
Well, I started, when I started in the industry, I started at like the lowest position, and that's not a P8. That's a cleaner in a cinema. That's where I was cleaning toilets. Okay, so the little town that I grew up in, at 8 years old, I went and saw Empire Strikes Back. It showed movies 3 times a week, and that was early 80s. And by the time I left high school, I was cleaning that same theater. And that's how I started. I thought it was in the film industry. I mean, naivety is pretty bliss when you're malleable and you're country smart, but you're not street smart because you're not exposed to stuff like that. So I just worked my way up through there. But I noticed that back home we don't have unions, and so there's not so much demarcation as there is here. So that's the hardest thing of grappling, was getting used to this person can't touch this or do what I'm asking because it's not their department. And that was, oh, guys, come on, like all this red tape. But I understand why you need that. So, it lends itself to a funny story that when I first came over here, one of the first pictures I did was in Miami. And unfortunately, the picture shut down. It never finished. Financing fell through. That was my first experience of that. But I was working with a predominantly Spanish-speaking crew. So they were, Puerto Rican, Venezuelan, Brazilian, Colombian, Central American, the whole thing. And so I literally just got off the plane. So my mother thinks I sound like an American now. So, so she's heavily disappointed in my accent now. But my accent was very thick 15 years ago. And I remember saying when I got off I'd talk to these ladies and gentlemen and I'd say, hey, mate, put a cutter over there, mate, and put a 12K over here. And they're all chirping away on the radios. And I'm wondering, wow, that's a long interpretation of a simple sentence. And then 2 or 3 days later, the best boy Grip came up to me and he said very slowly, he spoke very slowly, we've asked production where Might is. We don't know who this guy is, but you keep asking for him and no one's seen him. And like two dogs, we cocked our heads and I was like, what the bloody hell are you talking about, mate? And he said, yeah, that guy. So
That's awesome.
That's great.
So now, obviously, you do these big shows. I see you're also an operator on like Westworld and Justified and some other big shows. Was that always something that you were leaning towards? Is kind of like the bigger action stuff, more big set pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I generally, I generally like that action and whatnot. And that's, I taught myself lighting when I was a projectionist and an usher, and I just sit and watch. Back then it was Braveheart and True Lies 80 times, and I would teach myself how to look at the shadow, and if the shadow was there, then that means the light's coming from the opposite direction. And that's how I kind of rudimentarily really taught myself early filmmaking, if you will. So I was attracted to those types of films, and I grew up in the 80s, so Big Trouble in Little China and Predator and Aliens and movies of that. Die Hard was like, wow, this is what I want to do. And that was, I feel privileged that I grew up and I was a sponge in that era because it made so much of an indelible impression. So they're the type of shows I want to do.
It's also funny to like all those movies that you named. Yeah, they're like action movies, but they're also like some of the best directors who've ever lived, right? Like you're naming like the greats, right? It's like John Carpenter and James Cameron,
John McTiernan, and
McTiernan, sure, yeah. I was gonna say
Mel Gibson.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I think he's a good director.
He is a good director. Yeah. But yeah, so I think that's interesting, though, that kind of was an era where action films, there were a lot of genre directors at the height of their powers, like doing some of their very best work, which is really interesting to think about.
Yeah. And it was, so that's always kind of I've been attracted to that, and that, for right or wrong, that to me was movie making. But at the same time, you can have two people sitting on a couch, and that's movie making as well. And I've just been very lucky. I think when we all start our careers, we try to have a path that we go down. And for the most part, I think some of us think, well, we never want to be pigeonholed. We want to be a filmmaker that can do this, 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 and this. And then somehow your credits and your CV or resume start reflecting a path, whether you like it or not. I'm sure there's a lot of big action DPs that want to do just drama, really, drama and vice versa sort of thing. So, it was one of those things that I've always been kind of attracted to. And I thought, you know what, that'd be really cool one day if I could do that,
Let me ask, what was like? Can you think of a breakthrough project that kind of was the beginning of you getting more and more action work? Right. You said the horror film was the one that got you to the States, right? But like, was there one where it was like, maybe, now kind of like all these action TV shows are going to start calling?
This is something just, I think, for, that just shows that you can get a shot at something. But when I went into Lethal Weapon, I had one episode of episodic television.
Really?
I just had 1 hour of, yeah.
And that was a show you were an operator on, and then bumped up to DP for an episode.
Yeah, I shot one ep, and I went in there, and my girlfriend asked me the other day, like, who else is up for a show, and I just said, look, I don't care. I really don't care who's up for the show. It's either you win it or you lose. There's no who cares who came third or fourth or second or what have you. So you kind of just walk in there and go, look, I've got nothing to lose. Obviously, very respectfully, you try to put forward your strengths and all the rest of it. But I really just went in with one episode, and obviously a lot of independent films, but they're talking about a very select niche of action. And most producers or studios or what have you, there's solace in finding that, okay, can you do an explosion? I want to see that. And if you can, then that makes me feel comfortable, and let's sit in the room and let's have a chat, sort of thing, So I was just very lucky that I did a very good interview and won them over, and then the rest was history.
What kind of questions do they ask you in an interview like that, like for a TV show?
Well, the interesting thing is that usually, because that wasn't a pilot, that pilot had already been photographed, and coincidentally, Mick G had already shot that. So it was nice that 2 or 3 years later I got to work with him on another pilot. And so what happened was, there was a pilot, you get to see it, and then it's more of a case of, okay, what did you think? Sometimes it's very interesting because we all have instincts, visually, like, when you say, both of you might say, well, my version of yellow is this shade. And it might be in the same ballpark, but it might not be exactly the same. So you kind of go down a rabbit hole sometimes when you go, this is what I liked, this is what I can bring to the show and all the rest of it. But at the end of the day, there's really poker faces on the other end of that couch that don't really give much away. And at that point, my philosophy is, I would rather go in there and take a position. And if it's for whatever reason not the right position, or you tripped up, then so be it. At least you made a choice, as opposed to being middle of the road and not really having anything, because sometimes people perceive that as passion. If you're middle of the road, then there's no passion. But if you go down a path, it's like, this is the way I see it, and just sometimes you'll be aligned and sometimes you won't.
Did you have a sense of, the people these poker faces that you're describing, did you have a sense of their interest or expertise in the technicalities of being a cinematographer? Or are you talking more about big picture stuff, the approach, how you lead a crew, what the framing would be like, but stuff that in more layman's terms? Or are you getting into like the more technical of how you would approach something?
Yeah, I was really lucky. I mean, that first meeting, I had some really smart filmmakers. Like, they were just really talented, and the showrunner was there, was Matt Miller, very knowledgeable, articulate, and just a great guy. He definitely makes you feel you're a friend, and he's just got a warm personality. Everyone else obviously is very professional. You're meeting them for the first time, so they don't know. And I appreciate they're probably meeting dozens or 5 or 6 people. So the biggest success I've ever had is not talking necessarily about the photography, because I think at that point, if you're already in the room, it's because they like what they see. Now it's a matter of going, okay, do you see the universe the way I do? And 9 times out of 10, particularly in episodic, the successfully talking about story and characters does more for you than a flashy shot, because ultimately these are the parents of the written word, and they want to see that you understand their baby and that you can take care of that baby and you understand where it's heading, sort of thing. But that being said, where it all started at Lethal, they were very, very, very knowledgeable filmmakers, from shooting to story to, it was a great bunch of filmmakers, producers, production executives. I was pretty lucky.
So what did you say in that meeting? What did you say about characters and plot and story?
From what I can recollect, because it was 5 years ago now, it was more talking about the arc of the two central characters and how they were on the surface very different, but really at the core, they were looking for each other, and acknowledging that and how that might be interpreted through color, lens, textures, all of that, and just embellishing bit by bit with regards to that, colors and all that type of stuff. So it was taking what was obviously something that the studio and the creators were happy with the pilot, and what could I bring to that to continue what was already established. And that being said, when I left the interview, and the interview went, I thought, really well, and in hindsight, it did. But I remember I'm a diehard NFL fan, like diehard, okay? And I love a team that everyone hates. And
the Raiders.
I remember seeing on the wall, no, come on, someone who wins. And anyway,
okay,
the Pats.
Sure.
Anyway, and I remember seeing on the wall this beautiful, huge television flat screen. And I said to Matt on the way out, going, "Oh, mate, that's awesome. You can watch Thursday night and Monday night football here." He's like, "Oh, you're a fan?" I said, Yeah. And Matt was an Eagles fan. And I said, "Yeah, I'm a diehard Pats fan." And he was like, "Oh, I'm an Eagles fan." And I said, "Oh, that was a close game, that last Super Bowl or whatever." And I walked out and I crossed the threshold, closed the door, and I thought, "Oh shit."
Sure, yeah.
If he loves football as much as I do, I think I just lost the job.
That's great.
Because it's...
Sure, he takes it personally. That's salt in the wound, right? Yeah. That's so funny.
I'm a diehard Pats fan, so I take it.
But you don't want to agree with your cinematographer that much, right? Like, I think it's good to have... I just heard Maddie Libatique talking about how him and Darren Aronofsky are just like constantly yelling at each other.
I think as long as, look, you're never going to get on with everyone, and I'm working with a great producer-director right now, Brad Beaker, and on Lone Star, and really solid producer, Scott White. And so creatively, we're all walking in the same direction. And how you get there, sometimes you're going to have a difference of opinion. They might want you to zig instead of zag or what have you, but it's always for the betterment of the film or the show. And I think as long as everyone's walking in the same direction, I think, creative indifferences are going to happen. And that's not a bad thing. I want someone to I can't see everything and every bit of detail. So you want someone who's looking at something from a different perspective. I feel
you also were talking about the passion. Like, to me, when someone feels strongly about something, even if I disagree, it's more... I prefer that than someone that is like, yeah, whatever you want.
Yeah, there's nothing more disheartening than like, sure, that's fine, I guess. It's just like, oh man, all right, well, I guess we should just go home then.
I knew what I wanted to do when I was 8 years old. So this is kind of like, every now and then you'll sit back and I'll just go, shit, it's like I grew up, where I grew up was so far in the middle of the outback. There was my beginnings were working at a video store whilst I was working as a cleaner at a cinema. And that to me was, at those early days, was filmmaking. But even then, there wasn't any influence around in that area. So to me, it's like, without sounding pompous or anything like that, because, I'm not into that rubbish, but to me, it's like, holy shit, I get
it's
to
gratitude.
do this.
It's like the coolest.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially when there's like,
you
a super awesome camera move in front of an explosion and the guy just set himself on fire for the shot. Like, that's incredible. So speaking of, I want to dig in a little bit. You guys do all sorts of crazy stunts on 911 Lone Star. We would love to just kind of break down, a day in the life of a big set piece on one of these shows. Tell us, how does it first come onto your radar? Do they run things by you before they're even like putting, anything on the page, or are you kind of like getting the script and saying, okay, well, let's figure out how to crack this nut?
No, yeah, I think it's more the second. What's happened is that, you're constantly, the thing I like about the show I'm on is that you're constantly challenged. And there always feels like there's something new that it's like, oh, okay, this is something similar, but this is something new that we haven't done or what have you. So what generally happens is you'll get the script, and then obviously heads of department will come together via producers, and in COVID, we'll have Zoom meetings.
And do you get it before the director, or like how, are you shooting every episode?
Yeah, last year I shot every episode, and this year we were lucky enough to get a rotating cameraman, and so we'll probably get it at the same time. But because of the nature of the size and the scope of the show, we can't always necessarily shoot everything in 10 days because we work 10-hour days now, COVID. So what happens is some days you're actually doing double ups. So what would be my normal prep time, I'm actually shooting and cleaning up other episodes. But generally what happens is everyone will get it at the same time, whether it's a network draft or a studio draft or production draft as it evolves. And then you just read it. You'll have Zoom meetings from there where it'll be like, okay, let's talk about the stunts. Let's talk about visual effects. Let's talk about SFX. And then collectively head to department.
Sorry to interrupt, but when you're reading it, what are the things that you're looking out for as a cinematographer?
I'm just looking out for color, light, mood. I mean, generally now what I do, by the time I get onto the set, I do this on every, I've only started doing this in the last year, which is really helpful to me because the pace and the speed and the scope of what we do is so, you're moving at a clip. I'll generally just refresh myself with the sides that day, and I'll just put one word, and that's the tone of that scene. Sadness, anger, betrayal,
and is that
what have you.
Something that you're getting like from the producers, tone meeting, and director, or is this kind of something that's your version, your take on the scene?
It's something my take, but obviously that is based on all of the notes in pre-production, exactly what you just said, mate, which was very eloquently put, like tone and concept and all of that. You'll hear the showrunner talk about it. You'll hear the director talk about it. And for the most part, in all these initial meetings, I'll just be a sponge and I'll just listen to people talking. And I'll just, okay, that's where the production design is going with this, and that's where this is going. And then once I have that information, that's when I'll start interjecting and going, hey guys, can I make a pitch? What about this and that? And then I'll go to separate heads of department and talk to costuming and talk to SFX about these needs. And I want atmospheric here, or costuming. This set's going to be this color. So can we avoid these colors or what have you? And then obviously then really start getting elaborate with the director with regards to how do you see it? Okay, this is what I'm feeling. This is the way I'm seeing it. And so then by the time when I do that little default that I do every day with those one words, that to me is just muscle memory. It's just recollecting. And I try to read the script once a day, every day of pre-production. So it becomes, scene 43, I know what that's about. And then I'm a big stickler for time of day. Every show I've done, I'll talk to the continuity lady or script supervisor and just ask, hey, I need the breakdown for time of day. So this scene is at 6:30, and then it's a hard cut to 7:15, and then it's a hard cut to 2 p.m. What does that look like? And I see color to me, those times of days are very different, and it's very subtle. I mean, you really have to look for it, but I mean, we're talking 400 Kelvin. It's very subtle, but for me, it makes a difference in giving it a worldly view rather than day and night.
Look, it's genuine storytelling on a show that's got such, like, time is of the essence, right? You're trying to rescue someone or save the day in some way. Having an internal sense from the audience of like how much time has passed changes the stakes and all of that. That's really interesting. I really love that.
But from a production standpoint, how do you, especially when you're doing a big exterior set piece, how do you control the time? I mean, the sun is the sun, right?
Yeah, we just had that just the other day where we shot this external of an apartment, and it was blowing up, and the first responders were attending to it. And
you mean literally blowing up, not figuratively, like you were exploding the apartment?
Yeah. We did it.
It wasn't like, oh, this is too bright.
No.
Yeah.
No, and so you're in those scenarios constantly, where particularly when you're downtown Los Angeles and you're shooting in an urban environment, you've got this sporadic light through buildings and whatnot. So at that point, I just surrender to each shot being the essence of the scene. So if you're in hard light, I can't fight Mother Nature. Particularly with this show, the creative around this show, even though editorially what goes to screen might not necessarily reflect, the way we shoot is that the camera is an additional member of the 126. So what does that mean? That means the camera moves with them. If they're moving, camera's moving. So, and it's a lot of handoffs. So all of a sudden you're looking at, particularly with rescues, a shot could be 40, 50 feet long, 60 feet long, and you're handing off 220, 250 degrees.
Wait, sorry, what do you mean by that? You're handing the camera off?
No, it's like, okay, so this person might cross camera and you'll go with that person. They'll say a line on the move, and then as someone's countering, now you'll go with them, and then you might let them overtake you, and now you're over their shoulder looking at what they're looking at.
So the subject of the main character of the shot shifts basically as the energy of the scene flows from one expert to the next, basically.
Correct.
Yeah, that's great.
And commonly we will, the antithesis of what we do as cinematographers is, traditionally we'll do a wide shot and then we'll do a medium and close-ups, and you'll keep collapsing. But on this show, we'll go from a wide shot into a cowboy or a mid shot
in one continuous take.
So
it's yeah.
So at that point, it you get very creative with electricians and grips, and I'll walk in there sometimes just because I know what the camera's seeing. I don't expect a grip to know what a 32mm lens is seeing. So I'll walk in there and we might do a shot where the backlight looks great, and then as the camera wraps around, now that backlight's a front light, and I might just feather in a double net. So now the lighting is applicable and flattering to that emotional setting for that shot. So there's a lot of electricians and grips sometimes mid-shot going, hey, start putting a wire in now on that 18K and start doing this. And just so all of a sudden you're
the
feathering
dance of
in.
it. Yeah.
It's a bit of a dance, Yeah. So that's a lot of fun to me in that sense, in knowing that, yeah, we got that, and we can go from a wide shot to, shot here, and it looks great.
And is the 32mm your usual kind of like POV shot, like one of the members' point of view?
Yeah, I think probably the 32 is our workhorse, and then we might jump into a 50 or a 65, but those lenses are usually our workhorses, and anywhere in between that, because of we don't want to isolate the characters so much that you disappear from their environment. So we want to fill them in the environment, and particularly action works better for the most part. Explosive action works better wider, closer. So you want to feel that immersiveness of the environment.
Yeah. How many cameras are you guys shooting with?
Well, the other night we shot with 9.
Oh wow!
And is there a difference in the approach between a dialogue scene, or maybe one of these ones that you were talking about before, where there's like a ton of transfers and there's not a ton of space for gear or anything like that, versus a big expensive one-off explosion? How do you kind of parse that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes down to is the creative, the PD, and I kind of tend to agree with him. Sometimes real life is, whether I'm talking to my girlfriend or what have you, you'll be multitasking. You might be doing something at the same time you're having a conversation. So the belief is sometimes, for the most part, people are doing stuff and moving, even though the conversation might be something heavy. And then they'll settle and whatnot, just so you don't have a 3-pager where you're just sitting, because that gets really boring, and all of a sudden it's working against what the energy of the show is, sort of thing. But that being said, the approach is different in the sense of when shooting the effects, and since we're a fire-based show, I'm more working from the reverse of going, I need to light to a certain level in order to protect the flame. So obviously, you look at daytime, you look at an explosion, it looks fantastic. Why? Because you're around T16. You might ND down and shoot at 4s or 5, 6 or whatever, but at a deeper stop, you have that really rich color rendition. When you shoot out in the street at night at T2, it's going to white out. So it's all about trying to protect that flame. So when we get to the emotional and grounding scenes, you're not lighting to that stop. So you can take a very different approach in intimacy, but at the same time, I like to light in a way that allows the characters to go, hey, if you want to stand there, stand there. If you want to then midway go through and sit here, do that. So, so it allows them to go, that they can just be in their head as opposed to technically, where do I have to go?
Sure. Yeah. You never have to say, I'm sorry, you're in the shadow, and we're really making sure that the explosion looks awesome, guys.
Yeah.
So.
Well, we're lucky enough that our leads, they
Sure.
really understand camera. Someone like Rob, who's been, he's a veteran, and he understands where the lens is. And we have two very, very good operators with Bryce Reed and Dean Moran. And sometimes if a camera's feeling it, he'll just start pushing, and Rob will feel that camera moving in his periphery and hold that look or hold that stare. So it's that trust and dance that you do as you develop time and just working together and all that type of stuff,
Yeah. No, that's so fascinating. We've been doing this show for a long time, and I think this is the first time we've ever had a conversation about exposing for explosions. Which is...
I'm a stickler for it, and I'm always the worst person in a production meeting going, guys, no, I'm not shooting an explosion at 4:30 because I'm gonna be at the sun's gone, so I've lost a lot of that ambient, or because it's behind buildings or what have you, and I can't protect the integrity of the explosion. But that being said, if we were at night and say, for example, the pilot that we did last year, it's interesting because certain cameras that are closer to an explosion, I will underexpose, knowing that because of where that camera is in that initial blast, that's going to be early on editorially. So I will expose for the pulse.
Oh, that's interesting.
explosion.
Well, hold on. Let's break that down a little bit because I really love what you're saying here. So you're saying that the exposure level is dictated by what you perceive the editorial sequencing of these shots will be. And so you can kind of hedge your bets a little bit. That's really, really interesting. So you were saying the closer ones you underexpose because you think they'll be first?
Yeah,
Is that
because
right? Great.
because they're so close, unmanned, obviously. They're so close to the explosion that really the only usable part of that is the initial igniting. And obviously a lot of that stuff too, the closer the camera, I'll usually run higher speed because it's so instantaneous. So at least they can use those extra frames and elongate, obviously, the spectacle of it all. And just they have that option whether or not they want to or not, depending on the tone and the emotional current that the showrunner wants to continue through that scene. So it's just options. But generally, yeah, I'll do that. And then the further you are away and you're feeling it, then chances are you're going to use that camera once you're at the peak of the explosion. As opposed, and you're looking at a 2 or 3 stop difference, 4 stops difference from that, doing that to that.
Right.
Yeah, the big explosion. I love that.
What's the cheapest camera you guys use?
Yeah.
Are there GoPros, iPhones, DSLRs?
Yeah, we've used some GoPros. I try to destroy them as much. You always try to put them on like them, but they're resilient little things. They just keep on ticking. We do use Sony A7, particularly if it's like going in the water or something like that. We'll put it in a housing, but generally speaking, it's the Sony A7.
Yeah, it's kind of your crash cam, basically.
Yeah, exactly, mate. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
What's your main camera?
We run 4 minis, Arri minis.
Alexa. And so the 3.2K resolution you're not shooting?
Yeah, I mean, I kick it up to that when we do effects and so forth, but particularly if we are setting up for an explosion, we have a condor base in shot or whatever, and it's a lock off or what have you. But generally speaking, we just 2K.
Oh, interesting.
Because we're still the delivery's 1080.
Yeah, that's crazy because it's these giant budget network shows, and
I know
they're shooting compared to like these tiny indie films are shooting.
Yeah, I know it makes no sense, but I guess also too, as much as I would want to use those extra information, it also comes down to money with regards to. I know this sounds silly, but how many cards? How long are we downloading for, and all of that, which sounds really silly, but the volume of footage that we shoot.
Right. If you're shooting 9 cameras, that's a lot of cards.
Yeah. But also it's kind of, more evidence that resolution isn't really that important.
Yeah. I mean, it's always nice if you want to reframe and things like that. But, at the end of the day, to me, it's all about color and that curve. As long as you got the best curve to render that color and manipulate it, to me, that's everything.
Yeah. Well, and that also makes sense then that you're more comfortable cutting between like Alexa Mini and A7S, especially if you're just using a couple frames here and there.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting.
I mean, we average, I'm just coloring an episode right now. I mean, we average 1,000 to 1,200 cuts for 42 minutes.
Yeah.
Wow. That's crazy.
Yeah. That's wild. And we shoot a hell of a lot. We shoot, because it's all, again, in order to create, to give the option to the showrunner and the director is those options of, is it this person's point of view? Is it this person's point of view? Is it, what are we saying in this scene? Having that ability to shape that depending on where we start in Act 1 to Act 6.
I just want to know, how often do you ruin a camera? How long do you burn one through?
We haven't really destroyed one yet. It destroyed a set of legs, really badly,
okay.
actually.
Right. Yeah.
A car took one out, so...
okay, yeah.
But
that makes sense. That makes sense. But
yeah,
I wanted you to be like, oh man, we fry one a show, no big deal.
No, because ultimately, as much as that sounds cool, I then have to answer to people above me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
yeah. The camera body may be cheap, but that glass isn't, and
no
one wants to be throwing away thousands of dollars every episode.
Yeah.
Sorry. So now to Oren's much more thoughtful and mature question.
I'm curious about how you guys approach dialogue scenes. I think as a director, and we've had a lot of TV directors on the podcast, and we talk a lot about how there's a language that a show sets up, right? You kind of talk about the like Law and Order. Like there's these certain shows that they always have like a dolly, that's just doing an establishing shot. They have like a steady cam, and then they have like some long lens sniper type thing. What's the language in 911 in Lone Star? Like when you're doing just a dialogue scene?
Generally speaking, the way I approach it is that, we play with a shutter angle when we're out and about, and the camera's moving for the most part. And so there's this heightened reality to adrenaline of being out there. I mean, when you really think about it, first responders, amazing people, every single one of them, they're usually seeing us at our worst, which is, it's a commendable job that they do that, day in, day out. And so, but when they come home, they're like you or I, where they take off their turnouts or their uniforms and they're normal people with normal problems. So at that point, things become very grounded and relatable with regards to, what they're going through. Now, I think part of the success of this production company and whatnot is that it deals with most parts of the community, genders and so forth have a voice. And with each character, we have that. We have trans, we have gay, we have multinational, we have all of these. So all of these little things that pop up for each character, we try to address at some point or another. So these are very socially important conversations that need to be had, that I think is part of the strengths of the show, is that they talk about it on network. And so when we approach those things each and every time, there's a uniqueness to it, in the sense that we don't want to give it a cookie cutter scenario, but we just go off what feels right. So if it feels right to be Steadicam, it's Steadicam. If it feels right to be studio and crane or dolly, then it's that. So it's very much, the fun part of this show is when it's action, but when it's two people talking, and you're getting really to the core of any show is about relationships. And when you really get two people talking, to me, that sometimes I really enjoy that the most, because now you're getting to the crux of what makes people tick. So it's kind of like, what feels right for this, and I try not to really heavy hand and put and enforce anything on that, other than, the way we go about doing this. We'll read the scene first. It'll usually just be the first assistant, director, scriptie, myself, and the actors. And then as we do that, we just read it. Then they'll start throwing things around, and I'm just observing all this. And then
this is in the space that you're going to shoot it.
Correct. And then we'll just put it on its feet, and then they will start exploring with the director. And only if it's a problem for me, I might say, hey, can we not? Is it okay if we don't stand over there, or what have you, because you're wearing a dark uniform against a dark wall against it's not ideal. But other than that, they'll play the space, and then they will there's a lot of leeway for the characters to feel the environment and feel the space in which they're talking and discussing. And sometimes out of that, it's really just instinctual. A lot of this is instinctual, based off, you'll hear sometimes the actors say, I read it like this 5 days ago, but now after seeing it, I feel like I should be over here doing this. So all of a sudden, anything could be turned on its end, and you need to adjust and need to move and need to acclimate to that and all the rest of it. So sometimes that might be an actor saying, I feel like I don't want to give them my full attention. I'm having a conversation, but, they've annoyed me, and I want to keep doing things that I'm doing. So I'm going to go over here and I'm going to put this away. And then I'm going to go over here and put this away. It might read as though they're sitting and talking, but they're like, no. I'm not happy with you because of what you did to me the last scene. So I'm not going to give you my full attention. I'll give you my minimum amount of attention. So now all of a sudden, now you're moving. So there's a lot of that, which I love. Just basic storytelling is when you have actors in wardrobe on the set, no matter what I perceive as being signature shots, there's something always really exciting about just seeing how someone else sees the world and going, okay, so what do I need to do in order to capture that honestly without forcing my hand? And that, to me, all the movies that either one of you guys like, when you see really good performances and acting, chances are the camera's really just letting them do what they need to do in front of it. Because one of my favorite movies that I usually watch before starting a season of any show is I watch Heat. And it's amazing when you see the famous scene that everyone says they weren't in the same room, but at Kate Mandolin's, when Pacino's talking to De Niro. And you can tell that they shot that multiple cameras because the performances. But you're so engaged for 5 minutes of these guys just trading barbs and trying to one-up each other. Camera doesn't do anything. It just sits there. But you're so drawn into these two guys talking very quietly around a busy restaurant where people are eating and dining with loved ones and all the rest of it. And it's like, hey, if I see you around the corner, I'm not going to hold back. I'm going to shoot you, sort of thing. And it's just all the camera's doing perfectly is capturing that. And it doesn't need to add anything to it because the performances are doing it. And I think that's the interesting thing as a cinematographer, is knowing when to move and when not to move. Because really it's your forum at that point as directors, because if the performance is there, really the camera's just capturing it.
I love what you're saying, but is there no mandate that you need to have like a master shot and coverage in a scene? Like, I know from like Matt Barber, he's always like, you know, even when he's giving me edit notes, he's like, this is a perfect time to cut to a close up, or this line is really important. Can we be close on this character? Be like, oh, we don't really have it in close. Oh, should always get a close up.
Yeah, our showrunner and our creatives love close ups. They love close ups, and you know, generally speaking, there'll always be a wider frame, but it might start off wider, and then the character might overtake the camera and now brings us into a loose two or something like that. But there's always, you know, I think you always need to know where you are. Now, does that mean traditionally we need to be so far back? And no, but we generally will do shots where we might start on something, someone picks something up, and now they're exploring the space, which in turn is giving us a wide. So yeah, absolutely. But definitely a signatures for us is always close-ups, because of the nature of the way editorially we cut, it's always about getting to the emotion. If we are having to sacrifice frames to fit 43 minutes, then it's about getting to what is that character really thinking, and let's really see their eyes and feel what they're doing.
How much as a cinematographer are you thinking of transitions, like how this scene is going to cut to the next scene?
I always think, to me, when I break down a script, I know that the meat of the scene might change here, might go there, and all the rest of it. But I always think, okay, it feels right that we end on a mid shot, so let's start the next scene on this type of frame, a wider shot, or we finish on a close up, then let's use this wipe to then go to the next scene, sort of thing. So to me, in and out of each scene is really important, because then that gives a cohesiveness. Otherwise, it's a jarring hard cut from scene to scene to scene to scene. And you can really tell when that happens, because it feels like there's no visual storytelling. There's no thought necessarily in how these collection of scenes, and we will, on average, you know, we'll have anywhere upwards of, you know, 40, 50 scenes, you know?
Yeah, you're cranking.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit more about the nature of collaborating with all of your different department heads, right? Because you were alluding to before, you know, shows like this, they're big, elaborate machines. People are shooting all the time. You're kind of jumping between different episodes. You're cleaning up an episode, last week's episode, and you're prepping for next week's episode, and you're shooting this week's episode all at once, right? And also there are, in the case of the fire, you know, people's lives on the line, right? So there's a lot of things that have to go perfectly, and also you've got that artistry in mind as well. So I imagine the collaboration between yourself, special effects, VFX, and production design, and stunts are all, that's got to be, you know, that's a five-headed monster right there, that you all have to kind of be on the same page. And talk to us a little bit about the way that collaboration between those departments in particular work, and I guess editorial as well. So it's really the whole show, I guess.
Right. I think that for those types of things, it starts early on, you know, with regards to the prep and those meetings, those Zoom meetings. But for the most part, we all kind of have an idea palette-wise for the design and art direction, costume-wise, stunts, obviously, and special effects is obviously the anomaly from episode to episode. But other than the initial conversation, which is basically just hearing where everyone instinctually wants to go with it, then seeing the locations on the director's scout, then applying conversations, whether it be independently or via email, with regards to, okay, now that I've seen the space, now that I know where we're doing it, this is my input at this point. But generally, unfortunately, it's a very expedited time period. Because of the size and scale, what usually takes precedence are the big set pieces because of logistics. So once you're into that, unless something really pops out, it's individual emails and conversations either on a director's scout or at the office with the guys who, hey, listen, guys, this is what I'm thinking. Let's get on the phone. Let's have a quick talk about this and that. But it would be nice to have longer times, but because it's such a big beast, you're really attacking the problem that's in front of you, for those types of big set pieces. So that takes most of our time and energy in pre-production. And we try to, particularly anything that I know after shooting the show for 15 eps, that I know is going to be a problem or what have you, I'll address. But otherwise, I just know that, no, that's fine sort of thing. So,
Yeah, so you're saying the approach is oftentimes dictated by the location and the needs of the scene, right? It's like okay, well, we know we have X amount of space. It's it's open air, so it's safe to do an explosion here versus when you decide to say maybe do it. It's like practical versus special effects, basically.
Absolutely. I mean, to give you an example, episode 203 that aired some time ago was a fire, and a bushfire sequence, and the whole ep, and that was very heavy SFX. Obviously, we're in California, we're shooting for Texas, so we're trying to avoid mountains, trying to avoid palm trees. Oh yeah, every operator, don't point the camera towards that palm tree, And that was really a sense of going, okay, with visual effects, how far are we? It was working out how far am I to the line? Let's say the fire line. So I would always ask the director going, okay, how far away? Are we a mile away? Are we 3 miles away? And at that point, a lot of my coordination, because when you start working heavy with atmospherics like smoke, there's a point where it actually starts robbing you of exposure. The more density you have of smoke, then the darker it starts to get. So it's a very fine line between having enough there to feel the environment and to feel that, okay, I feel the presence that there is a fire over that ridge, and this is how close it feels. So at that point, I'm coordinating with SFX, particularly on that episode. Hey guys, I need smoke there, and there, and working out with them, okay, the wind in the valley is coming down this way. So if we're not seeing over here, can we put it here? Because chances are this will give us the greatest use of it. So it's at that point, it's dealing with that, plus with your sun seekers and whatnot, the sun. So we always have that little bit of smoke and mirrors, so to speak, where I can backlight the smoke and it can give me the illusion of a lot more density.
Well, and that's all so fascinating. On a television show where you're the DP in your shoot, you said you've shot 15 episodes so far, and you have a guest directors kind of cycling through. How do they interface with you on decisions like that, for instance, right? Where you're thinking about the way smoke affects the stop and where it should be placed so that you can get it backlit and things like that. How do you work with them on that? How does that collaboration work?
Generally speaking, it's been a really great experience thus far with the talented male and female directors we've had. But generally speaking, I think anyone coming into this world, it's just a big, hungry beast. Like, it will eat you alive. So there's so much that, is to be, you want to worry about. And then there's so much that are going, look, you guys are seasoned. You're the band of brothers. You've walked in.
Wherever you want that smoke, Andy, it's fine.
Yeah. So there's a lot of trust at that point prior to that. And I spend a bit of time just talking. My favorite part of an episode is just sitting and talking to the director in their office, just sitting in chairs and going, how do you see it? How do you see this scene here? I'm thinking about, and just spitballing. And that's where there's no pressure. You're at least a week and a bit out, so you can actually creatively just speak openly and just go, okay, now I know where they're at, and this is what I'm thinking, and this is, and as we get closer, after hearing all these conversations from them, I'll start putting together equipment lists and going, I think it's best if we use cranes here, and I think this might be better if we use this here, like drones here or what have you. And just get their idea before I put it in and go through the pipeline with the office and all the rest of it, just so it feels like, okay, creatively, we're in sync as we go into this unknown. And then basically at that point, It's more of a case of they know what they're getting into, that it's like, hey, I really want atmospheric here or what have you there that will help us and so forth. So generally speaking, at the beginning stages of prep, to me is the most freeing part of an episode, because you get to candidly just speak openly without the pressures of time and money, because they haven't come down on you yet. So when you speak like that, then, if there's something liberating about it, just speak it as artists. Tell me, how do you see it? And then I can basically shape them from there, going, hey, just letting you know, this is the way we work on this show. This is the strengths, these are the weaknesses, this is what we can do really well. And this is what we can do in the time limitations that we have. Just so you know. And most directors, particularly with these types of shows, they'll come in very planned with regards to, the set pieces and all the rest of it. If you can survive the set pieces, getting into the drama is almost liberating. You get to breathe and be creative, on a different level.
Right. I know we have to wrap up soon, but my last question is kind of just building on that. What Matt asked and what you just talked about is, when you're a guest director on a show like Lone Star, and the DP is shot every episode. Probably one of these. I think Bradley has directed half the episode, so he probably knows the show inside and out. But you're one of these directors that only gets one episode. There's this kind of balance between, the actors know the characters probably much better than you do, and they're probably going to know the drama and the emotional stakes more than you as the director. The cinematographer probably knows much more about how the shot selection, the momentum, the framing, the camera movement than you. How does can a director still kind of put their mark or have their vision, or are you finding that a lot of times someone is pitching something, oh, let's do this, the camera's, doing like a barrel spin as we go in here, and you're like, well, that's not.
Yeah, there's a bit of, that's a good question. There's a bit of that. I mean, I've been lucky enough to work with some really talented directors that have come through. And there has been one or two times where they were like, I like wide lenses. And I said, well, no, we don't put a 21 mil or 25 mil 3 or 4 feet away from our lead actors. We just don't do that,
because so it's not flattering.
Yeah, it's not flattering. And it's just not the show. And so there is that, part of when you get hired on all the shows that I've done, is the insurance policy for the showrunner is that in the absence of the PD, that you will protect the continuity of the show. So I've been lucky enough to move with Brad, and Brad and I have a great relationship. He's just an awesome guy, very creative guy. And I'll go do stuff with him, and I'm just so used to shooting 270, 300 degrees, and I'll ask him, "Hey, Brad, what don't you see?" Okay, 360, Brad. Yeah. So, but there is that element where sometimes some directors feel comfortable and safe with what their go-to scenario is. If they're up against the clock, if they're up against the daylight, if they're up against, actors' availability, just get me a wide 2-shot and a single. Well, we don't really shoot like that. The operators know how we shoot. So can I suggest this? I can get you this and this at the same time. I don't mean cross coverage. But I can get you this and this at the same time. And then that can develop into this. And that way, trying to translate what they have into what the show is, because ultimately I need them to succeed in order for all of us to succeed. So if they don't succeed, then none of us win.
What I'm hearing here, and I love this so much, is that I think your point of when we're in crunch time, everyone kind of falls back on what their instincts are. What's the safest, quickest way to get me out of this danger zone, right? And I think for some of us, that is okay, a master and two crosses and we're done. I know at least it's covered, the scene will move on. But what you're saying, and I think this is the better instinct, is not just what's my default, but my default should be, hey, let me talk to my team. I bet there's a really smart way to get through this. If they understand that I'm in crunch time and I'm feeling some pressure here, there's the right way to do it that's not the formulaic, boring way to do it, basically. And that if you collaborate relatively quickly, you can get past that and into something more interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's you always, because we all know this, that I think anyone knows that regardless of what happens, we can always, anyone in the filmmaking community can get a wide, a two shot, and a single.
Mm-hmm.
And
hose it down.
Hose it down. And the hardest thing to do is, without using the word hose it down, let's hose it down, but do it in the way that we shoot the show. Now, what does that mean for me? That's more pressure on my end to light in such a way, particularly when it gets difficult, when our characters wear black turnouts, they have the fireman helmets, and lately we've been doing very heavy smoke and fire, so now they've got the scuba mask.
Right. So all of which the ramifications are there's no definition on their figures, and there's no light. Like the helmet is blocking the light for their eyes, basically, and there's a wraparound, right? So actually, I am curious, how do you light the show?
Well, just put a LED light inside the scuba. Rest is CG.
Yeah. It's been a development of with regards to the look and whatnot. We have this kind of semi-bleach bypass feel to it, but generally speaking, when you're in that type of scenario, I use a lot of light because a lot of our contrast comes in the midtones. Because we have such high contrast values already, black, pastel design, you've already got your highs and your lows, so you don't need to really touch those. All of the contrast comes in the midtones. So by lighting up the midtones, now you can crunch them down, and all of a sudden you look at a shot and you go, there's contrast there, but I see detail in the fabric. And that's how you get that. So what we end up doing is, for those types of scenarios is, big 12 bys or 20 bys and bouncing light into those, and they're just wrapping around. So whenever the scuba masks or the helmets, underneath the helmets, and you see them, it's just wrapping around them. So you don't see a singular source that would be seeing as a reflection. It's just wrapping around them.
It's just big, giant bounces.
Yeah. So
like
at that
booklight style a little bit.
Yeah,
right?
and at that point, you're kind of floating a lot of stuff just above lens. So I'll use condors in a way where I'll have bounces and lights literally just above lenses. So you can move around, but you'll never see it.
I love that. Yeah, that's great. Awesome. Well, Andy, we could talk to you all day. We'll get into some schematics. We'll pull out some top downs, but we should probably let you get back to shooting hit television shows. Before we do that, though, we'd love to ask you to hang out and endorse with us real quick.
No worries.
Unpaid endorsements. So my unpaid endorsement for this week is actually inspired by this conversation. It's a tiny bit of a curveball. Have you guys seen the movie The King of Staten Island? It's on HBO Max. And look, I've always loved Judd Apatow. I'm a comedy guy. But there have been some totally valid criticisms of him, especially from the cinematography perspective. Robert Elswit shot King of Staten Island. And it looks pretty great, and I think is a very interesting way to look at a film and see that it's got certainly a look and like has some feeling and has some style, but also gives the characters room to do the same sort of Apatow-y, riffy, linorama stuff without feeling static, right? Like the thing that was always kind of limiting from those early movies is that they would just shoot cross coverage, and they'd have Steve Carell say something crazy, and then they'd have, Paul Rudd say something crazy, and then they keep doing that, and then they cut the best lines together, and the camera never moved, right? And I feel like King of Staten Island has found a way to keep the energy of those movies, but make it look a heck of a lot better. And also, it's got a fireman storyline as well that's pretty good. So
yeah. That's Pete Davidson's dad, was a fireman that passed away on September 11th, right?
Yeah. And so, also, I never thought I would say this, but Pete Davidson is legitimately good in that movie.
I've heard that.
Really?
Yeah.
That is an evolution for that guy.
I know. Look, there's nothing he can't do. He also check out some of his stand-up as genuinely like a 17-year-old kid is incredible. Like he's like a perfect stand-up
comedian. He's good.
So good. Yeah. But now he's an actor as well, and Robert Elswit is shooting his feature film. So sounds cool to me. So King of Staten Island is on HBO Max. Give it a shot.
I just saw the other day I think it's the Trial of Chicago 7.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
It's guys, it's fantastic. And Sacha Baron Cohen, wow. I mean,
Yeah.
he's amazing.
Very nice. Very nice.
And when you're dealing with a subject matter that's predominantly in courthouses and courtrooms, it's incredibly gripping with Aaron Sorkin's dialogue that you're literally sitting there going, wow, this is just, I mean, it's rapid fire conversations, but it's so well done that I was surprised. I actually loved it. I thought it was, and obviously the award season has started and he won an award recently and totally justifiable. Like he's incredible in it. Incredible. So that's definitely worth a watch.
Yeah, maybe tonight. We'll see. Kaplan, what you got, buddy?
Yeah, well, tonight I'm watching the WandaVision finale, which I know Matt is not watching. So I guess I'll triple down on these nominated movies. I just watched Judas and the Black Messiah last night, which I really enjoyed. It also looks great and stuff. Kind of a story about the Black Panthers in Chicago, which I had zero familiarity with. And the movie's good. I enjoyed it, but what really made me like it a lot more was HBO has these little extras that if you kind of scroll down on the interface you can find of just interviews between the cast and the filmmakers. And I watched one with Lil Ray Howard, Lakeith Stanfield, which I always thought his name was Lakeith, but they kept calling him Lakeith, so I'm very wrong about that. And the two guys that came up with the story, Kenneth and Keith Lucas, which do you know them, Matt? They're actually they come from comedy. They're these twin brothers.
Oh, wait, the Lucas brothers?
Yes.
Wait, for real?
Yeah, it's they pitched this concept to Shaka King, the director / writer. Yeah.
Yeah, I used to work with those guys back at Comedy Central.
They're Comedy Central.
They're
guys.
like stand-up comics. They're twin brothers.
They're like identical, the most identical twin brothers you've ever seen. In the interview, yeah, they're really funny. They're these twins and they finish each other's sentences, and it kind of made me like our podcast a little bit better because I was like, this movie was good, but when you get these, you hear Lakeith talking about his conflicted character and how he got into character, and you hear about the guys that kind of pitched the concept. It just rounded out my whole experience, especially nowadays when we're watching all our movies on a TV in our living room and we have our phones and our laptops and our family.
And you can't talk to people afterwards the same way. There's not that conversation out front of the theater.
Yeah. It gave me that experience. Yeah. So if you do watch it on HBO Max, which you should do ASAP because I don't think it's going to be playing there forever, check out the extras. And then another endorsement that will probably be out of date by the time you hear this, but I don't know, somehow I got into this Facebook group that helps people get vaccinated for COVID. And, there's a lot of different difficulties in getting vaccinated. There's a lot of neighborhoods, there are people that don't have internet access or a lot of people that are, in the older age group that don't have access. And so I've just found a lot of really interesting ways to find vaccine appointments. If you have a family member or someone that is eligible for a vaccine and is having trouble, in California, the main website is myturn.ca.gov, and probably everyone knows about that one. And half the time you go there, it says there's no appointments available. But there's another one that was just made by some coder named vaccinespotter.org. It scans all the pharmacies, CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid, and everything, and tells you who has appointments right now. And so, I don't know, maybe by the time this episode comes out, which is 2 weeks from now, maybe 3 weeks, maybe everyone in America will be vaccinated by then. I had this theory that maybe people wouldn't want the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and so they would just offer it to everyone in Hollywood. And then all sets, someone would just go to every set and just vaccinate everyone with Johnson & Johnson. But who knows? It's an ever-changing thing, but it's a great resource, vaccinespotter.org. So that's it. Andy, if people want to learn more about you, I mean, obviously you're on IMDb, but do you tweet? Are you on Instagram? How do we know what you're up to next?
I started Instagram, but I'm not on there all that often.
I want to see some explosions on that Insta.
Yeah, andystrahorn.com. And my DP Andy Strahorn is the system shots up there and whatnot. I need to update. I haven't updated since COVID because I had so much time on COVID. So
sure.
I started uploading stuff. But Yeah, so that's you'll see some bits and pieces on there, mate. If you go to DP Andy Strahorn on Insta, there's some explosions there and whatnot.
Well, if you want to check out all the stuff that we talked about on the show, you can go to justshootitpod.com. We'll have links to Andy's Insta and his website and everything there. You can follow us across all social media at Just Shoot It Pod. Instagram is blowing up. That's especially great. And while you're thinking about the computer and the internet, follow us on Spotify. That would be great. And I am across all social media at Mr. Matt Enlow.
I'm on Instagram at O'Kaplan, on Twitter at SmiteyPieleg. And if you have any questions, email us, justshootitpod@gmail.com. And this episode was edited by Sarah Weirda. Our social media master is Derek Aiello. Our consulting producer is an Australian, by the way, Ali Kornfeld.
Good day, Ali. Good day.
The music you're listening to is from the Free Music Archive and the artist Jahzzar. And we'll catch you next time.
Thanks everyone.
Everyone. Thanks, Andy.
The entrepreneurial spirit is resilient, and U.S. Bank is here to make sure that no matter what unknown pops up, business owners know that we have their back. Because problem solvers are the ones that keep us all moving forward by finding ways to close gaps, even when distances are being kept everywhere. So whatever you need to adapt and evolve your business, U.S. Bank is here to support you. U.S. Bank. We'll get there together. Equal Housing Lender, member FDIC.